Hello, everyone. On the previous sessions, so we talked about the history of sex, uh, anatomy and physiology, and what happens during fertilization. And also, we discussed the various stages of orgasm and give us a general outline now. And just very briefly touched on transgender people, which I'll talk more about on the present uh, talks. Okay, so that's just to summarize what we had briefly discussed. Now, what after the fertilization, what it leads to is the formation of a zygote. And now, for those of you with non-biology background, we'll just try to go over the basic definition of the 3 or 4 terms which we will use. And basically, an oocyte is actually an immature female gamete cell that is still developing and not ready to be fertilized. And that is located within the follicles of the ovary. And so these are, like uh, females have uh, several million cells, and as with maturity, they start decreasing and they shed at the time of the menstrual cycle we talked about. An ovum is a mature female gamete cell that has completed the division, the secondary division. I'll explain more about it when we talk about the genetic aspect of it, the basic genetic concepts. And so the ovum is sort of ready for a sperm fusion, which we elucidated in the slides from the University of Australia. The ovum has a reduced number of chromosomes because it's half the DNA of a typical cells. That's how we don't end up with double dose. Okay, and the important term after fertilization, what actually takes place as to how you're created is called zygote. And it's an ovum that has been fertilized by a sperm, and it has a combination of genetic material from both sperm as well as the ovum. So the cell has, again, the full number of chromosomes. Okay, and that goes on to divide and become embryo, and then later on fetus. Okay, and when it reaches at about 16 cell level, is called blastocyst. And now this was a controversy in the early days of embryology research before the science of genetics became widespread in research, because people who were doing experiments with animal fertilized eggs were under the impression that if you divide the egg into half, then only half the animal would develop. But a very enterprising zoologist in 1891 did very careful studies of the most primitive egg from a sea urchin, which is one of the earliest, lowest on the totem pole of evolutionary tree. And just with the earliest division that he was gently able to do, and 2 complete organisms developed. So one could say that he was the first cloning experiment that was done, obviously in animal research, as early as 1891. And this explains the formation of twins. And this may have to do with the obvious, at that time, there was no concept of stem cells. So, but in retrospect, we can say that this was the so-called totipotent cells. Okay, and so a cell can go on to develop the stem cell that can go on to develop into any organ of the body, such as liver, brain, stomach lining, or a red blood cell, what have you. Okay, and so this ability in the sea urchin lasts only for a few hours. In human embryo, it lasts a little longer, but then after a while, it loses the ability to uh, mature into any organs and goes into becomes like a committed cell. So that's, we are digressing. So I don't want to get too far into stem cell science at this stage. but just gives you an idea as to how the process and the history of that evolved. Okay, and this is the classical series that you may have studied in your early biology classes of the human embryo stage, that starting from one day onwards to gradually 8 days. And this is, at least in the present day United States, this is the big controversy with abortion debate in as to when does life begin. Now, when you look at it from the biology point of view, the earliest cells of embryo are just a collection of cells, and the body plan has not formed. Basically, the so-called morphogenesis has not evolved. So it's kind of hard to say that that is actually a fully developed embryo and has the potential to go on to develop into a fetus. So that, and later on, after and now the earliest classical zoologist who had a larger than life influence on the biology and embryology, named Ernest Haeckel, who was said to have a famous quote that ontogeny repeats phylogeny, means you go through all the evolutionary stages, so to speak, from a primitive organism, because you can just see that the fetus almost looks like a tadpole, basically. So, but that's probably an oversimplification. The process, this was done before the science of genetics became widely used in giving us a clear understanding of the molecular pathology that takes place. Now, I already showed you this slide earlier, but sex and brain, and I think the influence of brain is so much that it is worthwhile repeating, and as to how a lot of the sex, is influenced by our amygdala. And we also revised some of the embryonic and the hormonal stage. Just to repeat myself, the important hormones that we talked about: estrogen, progesterone, oxytocin, and prolactin, which is the breast milk hormone. Okay, now, so and then we also talked about the central endocrine axis that starts from the brain, with going to the pituitary, the so-called master gland, and going to the male and female cells in the testosterone. And there are various feedback mechanisms. And we emphasize the importance of androgen and estrogens, okay, and the male and the female hormones, and the chemistry is very similar, but obviously has a different outcome. Okay, now this is what most men have obsession with their testosterone level. So this gives you an idea as to how it goes about that. Obviously, the levels, which are very minuscule levels, so you can just see this is nanogram per deciliter. So it's an extremely tiny amount, but boy, does it have a powerful influence. So from fetus at the fetal level, because obviously some of that is, the cells are multiplying at a very rapid age, then the levels slightly drop. And then obviously as a child, it's obviously the sexual characteristics have not developed, and this huge massive surge that takes place at puberty and peaks, and then gradually tapers down as you get older. So it may explain why sexual dysfunction develops as men get older. Okay, and this is again the varieties of physiological changes that a pediatrician tries to judge activity. This is obviously the external manifestations are related to puberty. So one can say, and that it varies from child to child. And this is very obvious that you may remember from your own body as to what you've gone through, that the secondary sexual characteristics are gradually develop, the breast and the pubic hair, and the growth of penis and hair. Okay, and obviously the beard and hair on the face develops, the voice changes, the voice box, voice gets deeper in males. Okay, so these are the characteristics, and it has been noticed that at least in females in the Western society are developing puberty at an earlier and earlier age. That may have something to do with the diet, which has more processed foods, etc. But again, I don't want to get too much digressed. And then again, just to re-emphasize, this is what we talked about, the female hypothalamic pituitary axis, because that is the purpose of that axis is a lot more evolved, because it has to, with every cycle, it has to prepare the uterine bed for possible chance of conception and pregnancy. And so these hormones were isolated somewhere in the 1930s. Testosterone followed right on the tail, and so and again we talked about how the subtle influences of the hormonal changes is apparent at the time of ovulation and fertility. And again, I think this is a more detailed and a better appearing slide as to how the various parts of your brain are interconnected, and this whole apparatus, that is a part of that is the so-called limbic system that has to do with our emotional status. And these are the varieties of organs that are named here are involved in, human sexual response. Okay. And again, we talked about the thalamus, which is the relay center of the impulses, are coming from your spinal cord, for example, from your penics and genitals, and they are transmitted to the hypothalamus, which coordinates all the hormonal activity, and amygdala, which is the emotional response. Again, when you're in love, obviously amygdala is the one that responds. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to control desires. Okay, and sometimes people do foolish things. Okay, and then again there are varieties of the region, and the inhibition takes place in the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so obviously, so you don't go around chasing or grabbing anybody, just because you feel like it. Okay, so and there are times, so okay, and obviously, the chemistry of love is interesting, and obviously you get this huge dopamine surge. That's the only thing that you can think about is if he is your partner, and the early courtship releases other hormones, which are the so-called adrenaline, which causes your heart rate to go fast, which is well summarized in a lot of songs. And the limbic system rewards the addictive, so it's almost an addictive type of behavior that takes place. And again, so you obviously can only see positive things about your partner. And obviously, as the relationship progresses, you develop the oxytocin or the feel-good so hormone, okay, that develops, and that forms the bonding. Again, all of these have evolutionary traits, which we share with our ape and chimpanzee cousins. So, okay, all right. So and now the other hormone, which is less touted, is serotonin, which is also related in gender-related behavior. So when you're depressed, obviously your sexual drive goes down. Okay, and there are various receptors in different parts of the body, and again, so this is an inhibitory neuromodulator, so that suppresses the excitatory system that is activated by varieties of cues that we talked about earlier, and the role is much more complex than just inhibition. So it depends on which type of receptors are involved. And some of these receptors are even found in the genital tracts and the various nerve endings. Okay, and it has to do with, again, vasoconstrictor. So again, that may explain not in a mood type of response that you get sometimes from your partner. Again, so and that's why sometimes the antidepressants which target the serotonin and SSRIs, the inhibitors, can cause sexual dysfunction as a side effects. Okay, and now, and we already elaborated, but just to really get the point for oxytocin, which literally means swift birth. Okay, it initiates labor, breast milk, and this was rediscovered, and synthesized chemically by a Dutch scientist, and both of them were recognized with Nobel Prizes. Okay, moving on. So let's just see again. This is hippocampus, which is the area of the brain which looks like a seahorse. That's why it's named hippocampus, and that is connected to olfactory, means your smell of attractive female or perfumes have a huge bearing on it. And then it's again varieties of other hormones have a feedback mechanism, and along with the dopamine that we talked about. So various parts of the brain are involved in it. And this is, the real bonding syndrome, that the newborn stimulates this in moms just with suckling of the breast, and kind of rewires the brain. And that's, that one can say, I mean, not to use the somewhat derogatory term called mommy brain that takes place. And so again, that may be one of the bonding that may be beneficial for nurturing of the baby. That way, the mom is no longer turned off by the pee and poop, and with a stranger biting their nipples. And this is again, there are benefits, and obviously the immunity that is given or transmitted to the baby with vaginal delivery has been well researched. And again, the children that are born with vaginal delivery have a better outcome in terms of getting less infections and less asthma. So there is beneficial effect, and some of the research is being done to kind of reintroduce the vaginal flora, which has a protective effect for immune response development. Now, there are some rare hormones that a deficiency that can take place. The one which is fortunately rare is called a Kluver-Bucy syndrome. Okay, and that has some horrendous manifestations. So people, lose the active, control in their behavior, excessive hypersexuality, and binge eating, and that takes place. That has to do with the hormonal abnormalities, and sometimes a brain tumor can cause this sort of abnormalities also. So, and this was unfortunately, I think one of the Nobel laureates was guilty of child abuse, and so this is, unfortunately, this is a very rare disease, but it does take place, and it's been reported. Now there is a fascination in, at least in men and women, about pheromones, more in men than, but these has been well demonstrated in animal behavior. Okay, and the elephant urine or dog urine are the mark in the territory and attraction coming into heat, but the stress is hidden in human females, and in spite of varieties of research, nobody has been able to demonstrate the presence of pheromones or in adults. And there are a lot of fly-by-night people who are trying to market this and take advantage of it. And so we already talked about puberty and other things. So this is, and sometimes, the Flairman is one of those responses that is interesting, that is described as a flattening of the upper teeth and looking spiteful, and that transmits the pheromones by the vomeronasal organ. And sometimes in animals, the behavior is obvious, that it's licking the private parts. Okay, and this is the so-called vomeronasal organ. So this is what's been described. And in humans, it has degenerated, so it's not apparent. Now, the basics of attraction. This was a series done on attraction on the Discovery Channel out of UK, and hopefully that won't indicate the copyright strike by YouTube. But I'll try.
Psychologist Lisa DeBrine has spent years analyzing male and female faces. She works at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland in the foremost face research lab in the world. Like Kendra Schmid, Lisa breaks down the human face into its component parts: the eyes, nose, mouth, and skin.
These are pictures of an average woman and an average man. They're made from averaging together 60 different student-aged Caucasian women or men. And they can show us what differences there are between male and female faces. The female faces have a slightly smaller jaw, It's less squared than the male jaw. And they have thinner brows than these thicker brows that men have. Men have a more sort of square hairline.
But de Bruijn doesn't just analyze faces, she creates new ones, taking real people, then exaggerating certain features.
Here's an individual woman's face, and we can make her face more masculine. You can see her jaw getting slightly larger, her eyes seem to narrow, and the eyebrows come down. And you can see then, as we make her face more feminine, the jaw tends to get thinner, the eyebrows get thinner and come up.
Which of these faces do you find more attractive? This one or this one? De Bruijn tested the masculinized, feminized, and unaltered faces on numerous subjects. 81% of the men preferred the more feminine woman, and a majority of women preferred the manlier man. The differences between men's and women's faces are caused by the sex hormones.
When children are young, boys and girls' faces are really similar, but they start to change at puberty, and boys' faces, they get longer, the jaw gets bigger, the brows get heavier, and this is all due to the action of testosterone. A very masculine face in a man suggests that he has high testosterone, and a woman's face that's very feminine suggests that she has higher female hormones like progesterone and estrogen, and has a healthy reproductive system.
Most of us seem to be drawn to members of the opposite sex who got a strong dose of sex hormones during puberty. These faces indicate good health and fertility.
When we say someone looks attractive, what we're actually saying is that that person probably has good genes, that person is probably reproductively healthy. If I pair up with that individual and we have children, that those children will do quite well.
Okay, so that is very obvious, but I think, now this is not just true for humans. Obviously, even rhesus monkeys will press the a button or lever to get more fruit juice more furiously if he sees the picture of the female in estrus. So, and again, that and sometimes changes can occur with, to see a female, and the higher ranking monkey type thing. So this so there is a lot evolutionary link to this type of behavior all across. And again, now this was interesting type of thing. We talked about fertilization, okay, and the female ovum is not just a passive recipient of any sperm that comes in, that not all come out, okay, but sometimes, that it is selective preferences, that it is from the proteins that are covering the ovum would actually screen the sperm for more healthier genes. And now how does one test this? Obviously, it's hard to test this in humans, okay, because that would be considered unethical. But this can be tested in animals, because the smallest organism that tested fish, and the fish was artificially in a laboratory situation. It was fertilized by two different breeds of fish, such as, for example, salmon or trout. And the salmon, the same species sperm was preferred, and the chance of fertilization was a lot more than statistically significant. So one could see that the egg was showing preferences. At the same time, when they observed this in test tube, the same sex sperms were swimming faster in a more straight line. And this has also been randomly observed in some of the genes that had, like a gene for cancer, such as retinoblastoma, and the genes with abnormal mutated gene was rejected more than it was statistically significant. And that's an interesting magazine called Quanta magazine. That's and that has this. The reference was taken from this. So, and again, I can just illustrate. So this kind of breaks the Mendelian law, and the frequency that occurred was more than that would occur from the 3-to-1 classical Mendelian inheritance that would take place. As you can just see, genetic distribution of offspring, it takes place mutant versus non-mutant. Okay, so there was clearly, the female was showing a choosy preference even at the fertilization at the cellular level. Okay, and I showed you this slide already about, and I'll have now. Sorry, but I did not mention the scientists who were on the wrong track, involved in some of this research. Okay, this was circa 60s, late 50s and early 60s. Okay, and now again, there are varieties. When you get down to the genetic level, initially the default is female, and so when we'll talk about the silencing that takes place, and we'll go a little bit more into the genetics aspect of it as to how the X chromosome is silenced, and that gives the default the male pattern. And so the mammalian body is initially everybody starts out at double X, and then X is silenced and giving rise to the Y. And there is and sometimes that the alteration is not quite 100%, and that just gives rise to the whole genre of intersex, and that has been in a huge controversy, at least in the United States at present. And so there is a big spectrum. It's not a clear-cut, all or none law that takes place, and what may be true at the genetic level is not true at the external or the hormonal level, because it's a very complicated circus that takes place with development, morphogenesis, that is the formation of the body plan, and cell division that is regulated, as well as the effect of the hormones that takes place, and sometimes the steroid hormones, and even sometimes the cells can be unresponsive to it. So that's what leads to varieties of altered sort of mixed signals that the internal organs may be of one sex and the external manifestation may be different. Okay, and so this is, so varieties of level. Genetic sex is clear-cut defined based on chromosome. But I should clarify that sometimes even that is not quite clear. There is something called chimera that takes place that I shall get into a little later after giving a basic genetics 101. And the gonadal sex is very clear-cut, ovaries and testes. Hormones we already talked about, and the body anatomy and physiology. And at the same time, brain may have a little different tune altogether. So this is all, and this comes down to reading the identification of there can be a discrepancy between physical and mental. And so these are the varieties of definition. And okay, the sex is classified as biologically male or female. Gender is the range of characteristics associated with male and female attributes that assigned by the society. Sexual orientation is one's sexual attraction to other people. So these three can be a source of conflict internally, externally, and in society in general sometimes. Now, there are some varieties of hormonal. This was an interesting thing that came across, okay, that this talks about in the part of Dominican Republic, so this is a deformity or variation that I'm going to murder the pronunciation, Mashihembra, okay, and that is another word which is going dossier a male at 12 age. So, and these children are born girls and they turn into boys at puberty, and that has to do with abnormality of their 5-alpha reductase, okay, and this is made into the, so there are some mutations that takes place, okay, and so this has been a large number of, and the BBC had a series on on this countdown to life, and the children in the community who are born girls and develop penises once they enter puberty. So this is translated into as this word is translated to penis at age 12. Okay, so and the word Mashihembras is first a woman, then a man. So nature has some weird manifestation that show up at times. Okay, and so this sometimes the mutations have obviously a big role to play in it.
Enlarging prostate. He tells me it could get worse and lead to prostate surgery. Then he tells me about Avodart, He says over time, Avodart doesn't just shrink the prostate. It improves urinary symptoms and can reduce the risk of prostate surgery.
Avodart is for men only. Women should not take or handle Avodart due to risk of a specific birth defect. Tell your doctor if you have liver disease. Rarely sexual side effects, swelling or tenderness of the breasts can occur. Only your healthcare professional can determine if your symptoms are from an enlarged prostate and not prostate cancer. So have regular exams.
Talk to your doctor about enlarging prostate, then ask about Avodart.
Okay, so this drug can cause a side effect and this type of effect also. So that's why there's a warning that is associated with it, that you should be careful in terms of handling it because it can get absorbed. And now this is what we talked about, that this was the controversy that took place with Dr. John Money, whose idea was that the sex was neutral at birth, and obviously that does not have an innate instinctive basis. So obviously he was a psychologist by training, and he had wrong, and sorry, I think I messed up, and that so his ideas were disproven by people who did the genetic studies, and I forget the name of the scientist who did this study, but I think his name was Diamond. Okay, and now we'll talk a little bit about the transgender. Okay, and there are very famous cases, of somebody who was born George to Christine, and this was in the early 50s, and I think there was a movie starring Eddie Redmayne called A Danish Girl, and this was the early in the 1930s when he decides to undergo a painful and a complicated surgery of a sex change operation. So it was a very well done movie that we recall, and again, in the United States right now, there are big controversies occurring with the transgender and what type of toilets they should use. Okay, and so this is, again, we are getting into the and more complicated political arena, which I do not want to get into at this point. And this is well known to intersex variety to farmers. This was called free martin. So you can just see that the cows are born with different intersex conditions, okay, that takes place, and so this was also called Doc Martin. So this is due to anastomosis between placenta vascular system that masculizing hormones reach the female twin and disrupt the normal sexual differentiation, okay, and so this is well known to farmers and veterinarians. Okay, now we'll talk basically about genetics 101, because I'm sure you've had it in your high school or early biology classes. Now, as we talked about earlier, sex evolved around 850 million years ago from a genetic code, and that the DNA is faithfully recopied, and the mutations can arise in the germline, and the germline mutations are the ones that are transmitted, through the generations, and that has a lot to do with, the genetic engineering and with the CRISPR technology that has been around since 2012. Okay, and simply because they divide so fast, then another famous. Okay. So sex provides variation upon which natural selection can occur. Okay, and so this is, and there are varieties of genes there are varieties of inheritance that are elected, called autosomal dominant, which or sex-linked things, and the classic examples are given, such as illnesses like the dominant autosomal dominant diseases such as I'm sorry, I have to clear my throat. Okay, that can take place, and the recessives. The classic example would be illnesses such as cystic fibrosis, okay, and the sex-linked diseases which occur, such as hemophilia, okay, and And a lot of the hereditary diseases can occur, which are a lot more common in Ashkenazi Jewish communities and also in immigrant Pakistani communities in Britain. Okay, and the germline mutations are the ones can be transmitted through the birth line. Okay. Let me pause this for a second, and I'll get a glass of water. Okay, so we're talking about the inheritance that takes place of the classical spermatozoa, which divides into 2 cells, and then with the further division into 4 cells, and goes on to develop into sperms. Now, this is and from birth to puberty, the germ cells initially divide by mitosis and become what is known as spermatogonium, which is the doubling of the cell division that takes place at the base of the what we described earlier when we looked at the anatomy of testes, called seminiferous tubules. And then there are certain other hormones which take place, and spermatogenesis begins at the onset of puberty, when testosterone is secreted by the cells in the testes, and it continues throughout their adult life. And then later on, the primary spermatocyte, which undergoes what is known as a reduction divisions. So the number of chromosomes are reduced with the so-called secondary spermatocytes, and then the second division forms into 4 spermatid cells. Okay, and they again become transferred into sperms individually. So this is, and there are something called the polar bodies, which contains the nuclear division. Okay, and if the fertilization does not occur, then the oocytes, will undergo atresia. So it's wasted basically. So this is how the division process takes place, and the classical process that you may have learned about, the mitosis, and the reduction division called meiosis. Okay, so this occurs in all organisms. Of course, the viruses are different, so we won't talk about it, but the reduction division that occurs in all animals which have a sexual mode of breeding, okay, or reproduction, basically, that's the correct word. And it also occurs in plants and fungi. And so this is and that when the crossover division, the recombination of genetic material takes place in the various phases that you studied about in early biology. And this produces a reduced number of daughter cells, which are haploid, means they have half the number of chromosomes. And this is not a new process. This was described as far back as 1883, and later on by the earlier geneticist, okay, the groundbreaking work was one who was August Weismann, who described that the cells were not reproduced, all the cells went by cutting off the tails, and it was not a heritable trait. So the genetic shuffling and other principles were gradually worked out, and there can be certain errors that take place. Now, interestingly, the number of chromosomes is very finite for all the species. It's number 22 pairs in the X and Y chromosomes. Okay, and this is just to say that even as far back as 500 years ago, people were thinking about the concert in the egg. So this is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, and so it describes, that all the, like bishops, nuns, paupers, aristocrats. Okay, so this were all, relied from egg. So this is the symbolism he describes, so they were thinking on the right lines at that time. Okay, and then the great William Harvey, who is well known as discoverer of circulation from the heart, because initially Galen's idea was that the circulation was originated in the liver, but so he was the one who actually had proposed, and the lattice dictum ex ovo omnia, means out of egg all things. So that was finally people were getting that thinking correctly on a more scientific foundation. Okay. And so this is, again, the mystery of where all the babies come from was gradually being deciphered. And this is the classic example of the male and the female chromosome. And the X chromosome is relatively small and has far fewer genes, okay, that, okay, as a total of, okay, well, the X chromosome has 800 genes, while misspoke. The Y has only 70 to 80 genes, and some of these genes have, we'll talk about the male determining fraction, and some of the other genes are associated with brain formation. So the essential genes are somewhat different, the parts, but otherwise the Y chromosome is relatively diminished. And the number of chromosomes, if there are abnormalities in the transfer of number of chromosomes, then there are certain genetic defects that can take place. The classical one being trisomy 21, where there is one extra pair that is there, chromosome 21. So that is so-called Down syndrome. And there are other syndromes that are described as called Klinefelter syndromes, and Patou syndrome, which is trisomy 13. Okay, so, and this is the outline, as we mentioned a little while about the X and the Y chromosomes, and then X genes are important in brain formation. So as to where you inherit your intelligence, that may have, your mom may have more to do with, that thing. But again, intelligence is a very controversial subject as far as heredity is concerned, and now there's a segment, in the X chromosome called XSRY, which is sex determining religion, which is basically a DNA binding protein. Okay, so that decides the male sex by default. Okay, now this, and at least in about 10-15 years ago, there was this thing that the Y chromosome was shrinking, physically. So this is the classic depiction of the so-called SRY segment, type thing. These are autosomes which are identical to identical pairs, and you can just see how the SRY segment take along the evolutionary result from the kangaroos, okay, and other apes, So this is the Y chromosome itself has shrunk, and only the sex determining region has taken over, basically. So this is, okay, so a comparison between distant mammals and can inform us that mammalian genome and function that takes place. Okay, so, and the birds have a different way of origin that I'll go to in a little while. The mammals have the X and Y. The bugs have Z and W, which evolved from autosomal pairs. So there is a novel sex determining allele, okay, that takes place. Okay, and so evolution has gone through a whole gamut of pattern. Okay. And again, so that was this in 2012, as I talked about, there was concern that the Y chromosome was deteriorating, and in several million years it may disappear, type of thing. And that is indeed true to some extent. But there are alternative evolutions of different chromosomes have occurred in, at least in birds, and Australian platypus has a different sex hormones and more like those of birds. So the XY is just an ordinary chromosome, but other chromosomes have evolved to take over the function of sex. So no worries, the sex will still be around long after we are gone. So, and again, the platypus was the earlier, link there. So, and this has gone on for millions of years. So there's a loss of about 5 genes per millions of years. So at this rate, so the genes may disappear in 11 million years. Okay, but that's, I don't think, you and I would need to worry about it, everything. So, okay, so there's a lot of interesting research that has been done, Okay, now again, we're getting back to the erotic aspect, so of love and sex, which is, obviously the face and hair and voice, breast, and so these are all equally important part and different. That's how the attraction to the others. And we already talked a little bit about, how that Okay, now this was something interesting that, there is a well-known literary researcher who had written a very erudite scholarly book incorporating all the disciplines of art, literature, science, biology, and in a very poetic manner, a lady named Diane Ackerman. So when I did a class on Census Journal, her work was very helpful.
I had a rather difficult childhood. There was a lot of alcoholism in my family, there was extensive violence, and yet, in spite of all that, my father was the one who bought me this little pony out of the blue, and basically the pony was, my closest friend and the center of my life. So starting at age 8, I would ride by myself all day across Wyoming prairie on my little pony. And when I outgrew my pony, my father bought me a yearling quarter horse, and I had him all his life till he died. Probably my horses, they carried me through a difficult childhood. They got me through that. It is really interesting, and I grew up horse crazy. When I became an adult, I realized that it was something beyond my own personal experience. And what I began to realize is that there's something profoundly empowering about this relationship that some girls have with horses. It's a relationship that's very much, a close, intimate relationship. And in that relationship, I think girls gain a kind of power that they don't necessarily have otherwise in life. And I think that happens in a number of ways. Certainly that they begin to, have a capacity to work with a large animal over 1,000 pounds. And girls who are horse crazy tend to be horse crazy instead of boy crazy. Girls who are horse crazy are focused more on things like their strength and their capacities with horses than on things like thinness, femininity, attracting boys. And I found that even the fantasies that horse crazy girls had were empowering. So one woman I spoke with said that she spent, some 6 years just completely passionate about horses, and she would play horses, she would read horses, she would draw horses, she would talk horses, she would think horses. And when she played, for example, with her friends, they would do, fantasies where they were out in the woods riding in an adventure, or they were rescuing someone, or they were training a horse that was untrainable. As she put it, she wasn't princessy. She was a horse girl. So men and women compete equally once they're on the horse. It's the one sport that's been gender neutral for decades, from the highest to the lowest level. So just little tiny shows that happen in rural areas all the way up to the Olympics. But as you go down sort of the hierarchy of support, of the sport, there are more and more women, to the point of, a lot of the smaller shows around the US are just dominated by women. It's only women. Well, there's a whole rich response by consumer culture to horse crazy girls. I mean, this was an opportunity to make money, of course. So there's a lot of stuff, right? A proliferation of toys and books and paraphernalia for girls who may not ever be around horses but are passionate about them. We didn't have much money for toys, but I had a little tiny wooden stable and 3.
Okay, so I think, that's an interesting, diversion into how, gender identification and growth takes place. And the same thing with men.
I had a
Okay, so I won't dwell too much into it, but getting back to the real science, there was a diversion for ourselves, which we could use that from time to time from a heavy fact-filled talk, the X chromosome inactivation.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast I'm going to talk about X inactivation. Sometimes we call this lionization, and that's kind of giving credit to the person who discovered most of this, which is Mary Lyon. But I want to start the whole thing by talking about calico and tortoiseshell cats. Calico cats like this one and tortoiseshell cats like this are almost always female, which puzzled scientists for a long time until we finally figured out how that works. And it puzzled Mary Lyon as well. Here she is. She worked at Cambridge. But basically what she found is that when she was working with lab rats, some of them would be a white, some would be a gray, and some would be kind of a tortoiseshell between the two. But what she found is that most of those tortoiseshell mice were females, and so most of them had 2 X chromosomes. And she was also working on chromosomes and why some disorders are more prevalent in females than they are in males, and so we know that's sex linkage. But basically what she found is that when you look into the nucleus of a cell, so this is in the nucleus, in every cell of every female, one of the X chromosomes will be active, and so it works perfectly, but the other one is going to be inactive. It's going to fall apart. And so if you're a female in all of your cells, only one of the X chromosomes is active and the other one is inactive. It's okay though, because you're fine. On guy's side, same thing. We only have one X chromosome, and so sex chromosomes like this are kind of designed to just work on their own. When it breaks apart like that, we call that a Barr body, or that X chromosome is now inactivated. And so let me kind of talk you through how this works. Well, basically when you're born, before you're born, when you're a zygote, that zygote, if you're a female, will have 2 X chromosomes. And those X chromosomes will be copied when the cell goes through mitosis. And so we go from having 1 cell to 2, and then to 4, and then to 8. And I could keep doing this, but basically when you get a big ball of cells like this, these are called stem cells. They're cells that can become any other cell. But right around this time, when you start to get this big blastula, there's basically a flip of the coin that goes on in each of the cells. And so one of the X chromosomes will simply wad up and become inactivated. So this one might wad up, and it's a 50-50 chance which are the ones are going to wad up. So it might be that one, it might be that one. So it's totally random which one's going to wad up in each of these. Now, the one that's left, it's going to be able to express all of the genes that are found on that. And what's interesting is that all the cells that come from this cell likewise are going to have one X chromosome that's inactivated and then one X chromosome that's activated. And so basically this stem cell, once that flip of the coin has occurred, it's for the rest of the life of the cell and all the cells that come from that. And so that tells us why a calico cat is female. And let me talk you through that. So if you're a male cat, you could basically be an orange cat or a black cat. Or you could be a white cat if you're lacking the pigment on the hair. And so let's look at this. So it's found on the X chromosome. If you have the black gene on your X chromosome, since you only have one X chromosome, then you're going to be a black cat. If you have the orange gene on your X chromosome, then you're going to be an orange cat. And it's pretty straightforward because in every cell there's going to be an X chromosome with that gene making that pigment color. Now let's look at the female side. So if you're a female cat and you have 2 X chromosomes, if both of them are black gene, then you're going to have a black cat. Now what you should know is that in each of the cells of this cat that produces this black pigment on its skin, it's going to be a different X chromosome that's working in each of those. So that flip of the coin has occurred. Likewise, if we've got, an orange gene in each of those X chromosomes, same thing. It's going to be orange. But what's weird is if you're heterozygous for it. And so if you're a female who has one X chromosome with a black gene and one with a orange gene, well, how could this occur? Well, simple. Let's say we match this, a black cat with an orange cat, then all of the offspring are going to be like this. And so what is it going to look like? Well, this is not a great animation or a great picture, but basically what you'll have is splotches of black and splotches of orange. And so let's look at this black right here. Basically what happened is at the stem cell stage, the orange gene, basically this orange gene became a Barr body, so it became inactivated, and all the cells that came from that produced black pigment. I think that's really cool. Likewise, in ones where the black one wadded up, all the cells that come from that is going to produce orange pigment. And so that's X inactivation. It's rare that we see this occurring.
Now, this Barr body is interesting for the cat, but this was the earlier way for during Olympics. The sex determination was used by Barr body before the widespread availability of chromosome analysis in DNA took place. So that was the earlier way of determining sex. Just began to keep people who have male characteristics out of competing with females. So that was, one way of testing it, properly in the 50s and early. So Barr body had practical uses. Okay, and again, so there are many ways how sex determination takes place. You can just see this is the mammals. Okay, X, Y chromosome set. The birds have it differently. You can see this in red. Okay. And there is, so nature has experimented in huge ways. So this is XY, okay. And again, so females have one Z and a W, okay. Males have 2 copies of Z, okay. And so this is, and so there are varieties of ways nature has experimented type of thing. So, and some fish, we already talked about the fish, some fish can change sex, and that became the big hit during the Disney movie called Finding Nemo. The clownfish started out as a male, okay, type of thing. And if the female dies, then the largest male becomes female, and so that just goes on. And there is tiny little fish called goby, and if the male dies, the largest female becomes male in a few days. So there are varieties of evolutionary changes that takes place, okay? And so this is the Y chromosome and the genetics of male beauty. So, and we already talked about how the male is the one that is more colorful in varieties of species. And the bird, the females have one Z and W, males have two copies of Z, okay? So, and there are varieties of hormones, and then the female idea of beauty is more in males that we are, we're all very aware of, especially the classic example of the peacock and the turkey snood, okay, that we talked about. Then again, just to repeat the point about the sex and gender, we talk about the biological sex and gender, the gender roles where, characteristics described as from society, the masculine versus feminine, okay, and the internal organs can be sometimes in conflict, causing the whole. And a lot of other cultures have accepted the transgender ideas in the Middle East, in Asia, that is well accepted. Sometimes, only in the West that the controversy has surfaced. And there was obviously it was always there under the cover, but So now again, homosexuality was widely accepted in ancient Greek, but with Puritanism and the rise of Christianity, it became a big taboo and went through varieties of punishment that was inflicted on, especially the classic example being Alan Turing, who was jailed for his homosexual tendency, along with D.H. Lawrence. And so the history of homosexuality is in a class by itself, but we won't get too much into it at this thing because of time limitations. Okay, and we already talked about some of the differences, biological differences in very tiny areas of brain that I mentioned Dick Schwab earlier. Okay, and there are other areas in also brain which can be slight difference in males and females. Okay, parthenogenesis, that's an unusual phenomenon that takes place in certain animals. They can reproduce themselves asexually, especially like some of the lizards have been well to do that. Insects and some of the reptiles have been known to do that. Okay, and so this again gets down to the concept of so-called virgin creation. Okay, and we talked about the chimeras, and sometimes there has been a controversy that some of the females have had two copies of different genetic material. Rare, but it does occur. Okay, and now this she is a very interesting, colorful presenter, named Mary Roach, and she has done some an interesting book about the science of sex that that she has researched all around the world, interviewing outright normal and some bizarre all around the world, and the book is appropriately entitled Bonk. Okay, so you can, if you get a chance, please browse through it.
There is considerable evidence for upsuck in the animal kingdom. Pigs, for instance. In Denmark, the Danish National Committee for Pig Production found out that if you sexually stimulate a sow while you artificially inseminate her, you will see a 6% increase in the farrowing rate, which is the number of piglets produced. So they came up with this plan, this 5-point stimulation plan for the sows, and they had the farmers, there's posters they put in the barn, and they had a DVD, and I got a copy of this DVD. And this is my unveiling, because I'm going to show you a clip. Okay, now here we go. See, off to work. And all looks very innocent. Okay, he's going to be doing things with his hands that the boar would use his snout. Lacking hands. Okay. This is the boar has a very odd courtship repertoire. This is to mimic the weight of the boar. You should know the clitoris of the pig inside the vagina, so this may be sort of titillating for her. Here we go. So, and the happy result.
Okay, so Mary Roach is in anything to say. She's a colorful, and this is again, that's even the respectable Kinsey report asked rural males about animal experiences, and he got a response of about 25%. So that may shock the urban clientele. So, and this is, and one can actually buy a boar odor spray to get the sow in heat on farm animals. Okay, okay, and this is AI. In this case, does not mean artificial intelligence by any means. No, but it means artificial insemination. So one has to be careful, with abbreviations. Okay, so I think
there is concern.
Okay, so I think we'll go over one or two of, and now this again gets down to coital imaging. This goes down for several centuries back, to the all-encountering genius Leonardo, and this was reproduced in Holland with MRI studies, by various anthropologists, Okay, so this was, and this was Leonardo's, this thing was from his before his dissection days, so he described tube connecting womb and the breast, and the milk was formed, diverted from menstrual blood. Okay, and so this was, and it took for almost 500 years before the real anatomy was worked out by a Dutch person named Robert Dickinson in 1900. Okay, and now we'll go with one more slide before we stop for this day. Okay, and this was done, not to be outdone, their Dutch ancestors and researchers. This was, and I'm sure I mentioned earlier about the so-called Ig Nobel prizes, and this was one of the Ig Nobel prizes in the respectable journal about the whole body MRI. They found a willing couple to have sex while undergoing MRI. So this instruction was given with intercom to hold that pose, and they were able to determine the angle of the penis. Okay, and this was submitted to Nature with additional data was collected, and this was published in the British Medical Journal. Okay, and so this was done by various Dutch physiologists. So I think this brings us to about an hour. So I still have at least another hour worth of material, but I think my voice is getting a bit hoarse. So I'll stop at this stage. I'll stop my share in my recording, and we'll finish with the last session, which will be, okay, we'll end the meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.